People oftentimes talk about how the sun never set on the British Empire, but the first empire to live in perpetual daylight was that of Portugal. Today, Portugal is not a major power player. It is known mostly for vacation trips, port wine, and football hooligans. But during the 1400s, Portugal became the world's first true superpower. Sure, there were great powers of the past, such as the Persians, Romans, and Han China, etc. But it was not until Portugal arrived on the scene that the world's oceans would be tamed by civilization, and worlds untouched by each other would merge into one global system. The geopolitics of the Portuguese Empire were shaped by maritime exploration, strategic positioning, and trade. As the first global empire and pioneer of European overseas expansion during the Age of Discovery, Portugal's geopolitical strategy focused on controlling key maritime choke points, along with profitable trade routes, and establishing a network of fortresses and colonies across much of the then known world. Portugal, along with Spain, had broken off of one of the Islamic world's most important footholds in Europe through the Reconquista, kicking out Muslims and Jews. At the time, there was quite a lot of interest in the Orient. Hearing tall tales by Marco Polo, Europeans wanted to trade with the powers of India and China. The only problem is that the Muslim Ottoman Empire was blocking land routes. The Portuguese would use the Carnival ships, which could sail off the continental shelf. Portugal would colonize the Azores and Madeira Islands. These would later be pit stops for far longer voyages to the New World. At the time, however, the Portuguese were unaware of such lands further to the west. The Portuguese would sail across the coast of West Africa, setting out trade posts for gold, ivory, and, more depressingly, slaves. West and Central African empires would conquer stateless peoples in the interior and sell them off to the Portuguese and later other Europeans. This gets way more disturbing later on. The Portuguese would eventually travel past the Cape of Good Hope in what is now South Africa. This was a feat not accomplished since, arguably, perhaps the Phoenicians of the Iron Age. Societies in southern Africa were less complex than those in West Africa, but the Portuguese would move forward and set stage for the colonization of what are now Angola and Mozambique. The Portuguese were also quite adamant to convert the populations to Catholicism, which would play a role in Christianizing sub Saharan Africa. However, they would be less successful in the next pit stop, India. Vasco da Gama would explore much of the coast of Africa and the Indian subcontinent, setting up trade routes and firing cannonballs into people who said otherwise. The Portuguese would set up the colony of Goa, which would remain separate from the colonization of the British. The French would take Pondicherry. Goa would eventually merge with India to become a vacation destination, but at the time, it would become the premier destination for the spice trade. Speaking of the spice trade, the Portuguese would move to Southeast Asia, and that would be arguably the grand prize. The Portuguese overzealousness in converting the population to Catholicism, however, led to many natives preferring the Dutch and British. The Portuguese, as a result of this, would be left with a tiny handful of islands, most notably East Timor, half an island, which was still good to get some nutmeg, cloves, and mace, but not as good as what they were hoping for. The Portuguese would also travel north to set up the colony of Macau. The British would also take up nearby Hong Kong during the Opium Wars. This trend would continue until 1999 when China would have both European powers hand them over. Macau today is essentially the Las Vegas of East Asia, and while it has been handed over to China, it has not seen the same resistance civically that Hong Kong has. The Portuguese would eventually become the first Europeans to make contact with Japan. The Portuguese were stunned to encounter a non European people as advanced as they were. The Japanese would adopt Portuguese words into their common vernacular, and even elements of Portuguese food, such as tempura. Christian institutions would shape and modernize Japan, but they would never truly convert Japan. On the other side of the world, Portugal's Iberian neighbor slash rival would make contact with the Americas. As you know, this is called Spain. The Pope would divide the world into a Spanish western half and a Portuguese eastern half. However, some Portuguese ships were blown off course and landed in what is now Brazil. The Portuguese would set up the colonial outpost of Rio de Janeiro, among others. At first, it was primarily used for harvesting Brazil wood, which the modern country gets its name from. But by and large, this colony was ignored until Napoleon conquered Portugal during the Napoleonic Wars, as Portugal was still a colony of the British. The Portuguese monarchy would eventually move to Brazil as a result of this and like it so much that they kind of set up shop there. The population of Brazil would grow as more and more settlements would pop up more inland. This was by and large the result of immigration, some of which came from Europe, some of which came from other Latin American countries, and a lot of which came, well, let's just say from African slavery. Eventually, Brazil would become independent and form its own empire, becoming the last country in the Americas to ban slavery. Portugal proper would keep its colonies in the Old World for a while. However, its power would eventually be overtaken by the Spanish, French, Dutch, and eventually British. At this point, their trading posts were rather inconsequential compared to the full scale colonies of the British and French. During World War II, the Japanese, which learned a great deal from the Portuguese and other European powers, had utilized their knowledge and skills to take over a wide swath of the Asia Pacific region. Portugal had remained neutral throughout the war, but it was clear that European colonialism was soon to be a relic of the past. In the aftermath of the Second World War, Portugal fought wars of independence against various uprisings, most notably in Africa, such as in Mozambique and Angola. In Angola, you saw a quasi successful Marxist revolution during the Cold War. The Portuguese would eventually hand over Macau to China in 1999, and this would eventually become a formidable economic power through the magical power of gambling. China, after all, at this point was far more powerful than Portugal, something that was rather unthinkable during the 1800s. Portugal today still maintains a few colonies, such as the territories of the Azores Islands. Their empire is gone, but other empires have taken up the mantle of the premier naval power, with the Dutch, then the British, and now the Americans. This has brought about a pluralistic world, a more interconnected world as a whole, and Portugal's legacy, in spite of all of its flaws, is still part of that. Thanks for watching.